He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't carry a badge. He had no invitation. But when a single dad veteran arrived at the funeral of a 4-star general holding his daughter's hand, and a single red rose, something happened that no one could explain. The guards tried to stop him. The crowd didn't recognize him. But when the general's name was spoken, and a forgotten pin on his coat caught the sunlight, everything stopped, and history remembered a man it almost erased. The morning broke with a silence so deep it felt holy. Mist clung to the ground like a memory unwilling to lift. Rows of white marble headstones stood in solemn formation across Arlington National Cemetery, softened by the dawn's golden hue. A slow breeze stirred the hem of the little girl's coat as she stepped out of the truck and into the stillness. Michael Dawson didn't speak. He never did in moments like this. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a single red rose wrapped in a small piece of linen. The stem was wrapped in green floral tape, the petals perfectly formed, as if refusing to wilt even in the September chill. He handed it gently to his daughter. Maya took it with both hands, cradling it like it was alive. Her eyes, large and quiet, looked up to him for reassurance. He gave a small nod. They began walking. The old green jacket he wore, once part of a Marine Corps uniform, had long since faded to something between olive and memory. His boots, though polished the night before, bore the creases and scuffs of years. At 39, Mike carried himself like a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. He walked with a subtle limp, but Maya never asked why. Today was not a day for stories. Today was a day for promises kept. They passed the entrance checkpoint slowly. There were security gates ahead, higher clearance for this funeral this particular morning. A 4-star general was being laid to rest. General David Grant. To the world, he was a decorated war hero. To Mike Dawson, he was something more. A man whose life he had once held in his arms while enemy fire tore the jungle apart. A man who had whispered through cracked lips and bloodied teeth, "If I don't make it, tell my family. And if I do, I owe you more than I can say." But General Grant had lived, and Mike had disappeared just as quietly as he had arrived. Now, nearly 2 decades later, he'd come to honor him. He had no formal invitation, no official status. He wasn't on any list. But none of that mattered. He had a rose and a promise. Maya's hand was small in his, but her grip was strong. As they reached the inner gate, a tall figure in a crisp uniform stepped forward. His boots stopped with precision. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your credentials," the young officer said, eyes narrowing with authority. His name tag read, D. Myers. Mike paused. He pulled off his cap slowly and nodded. "I'm not on the list," he said quietly. "But I'm here to pay respects to General Grant. I served with him." Dylan Myers blinked, unimpressed. "I'm sorry, sir. This is a restricted ceremony. Only authorized personnel and invited guests are allowed past this point. I'll have to ask you to leave." Mike said nothing. His silence wasn't defiance. It was simply stillness. Maya stepped half behind him, clutching the rose tighter. Her eyes darted from her father to the soldier, sensing something heavy in the air. "Look," Sir Myers added, softening just slightly. "I get it. You're probably a vet, and I respect that. But we've got orders." Mike's eyes lifted. Calm, measured, but resolute. "I understand," he said. "I'll wait here." "You'll wait." Mike nodded, his voice a low rumble. "I made a promise. To the general. I'll wait until the ceremony begins. If I'm still not allowed in, I'll leave the rose at the gate." Something about the way he said it made Dylan pause. Not the words, the weight behind them. But rules were rules. Dylan glanced at Maya, then at the rose. "It's really not a good idea to stay here, sir." Mike didn't move. Then do what you have to do. A flicker of irritation crossed Dylan's face, but before he could speak, a woman in dark civilian dress walked by, glanced at the scene, and whispered to her husband. "Is that man being kept out?" A few others nearby turned to look. Mike didn't notice them. Or maybe he did. But his gaze was fixed ahead at the distant flag-covered casket near the amphitheater steps. Maya tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered. "Why won't they let us in?" He looked down and smiled softly. "Sometimes sweetie people don't know the whole story." She nodded solemnly, as if she'd heard this before. A bead of dew rolled down the edge of the rose petal in her hand. The red stood out against the soft gray all around them, like something alive in a world of stone. More people began arriving, and the guards turned their attention to new arrivals, but Dylan kept looking back at Mike. The way the man stood still, composed like a stone monument that had somehow come to life, bothered him. He wasn't used to that kind of quiet. He wasn't used to men who didn't flinch when turned away. Something didn't sit right. Sir Dylan said again, stepping closer. "You said you served with General Grant." What unit? Mike's voice was low but steady. "Task Force Shepherd, Recon Detail, 2007. Dylan blinked. That unit had been Black Ops, classified even to most officers. He didn't respond. Instead, his eyes drifted down, to the left breast of Mike's coat. Pinned there, barely noticeable beneath the faded lapel, was a small silver emblem, dull from years of wear. Dylan squinted. It wasn't a standard-issue pin. It looked like a jagged piece of metal shaped into a shepherd's crook, with etchings worn smooth by time. Something flickered across Dylan's face. Recognition, maybe. Or confusion. But before he could ask anything further, Maya spoke. "Can we still give the rose to the general?" she asked, voice barely audible. Mike knelt beside her and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "We'll try," he said, his voice calm. But beneath the surface, the storm was rising. He stood again, tall and unshaken, as the mist began to lift. The sun rose higher, but the chill lingered. It wasn't just the cold of early autumn, it was the kind of cold that settled in when something wasn't right. Mike Dawson stood like a granite statue just outside the gate, his hand resting lightly on his daughter's shoulder. Dylan Myers checked his watch. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 20 minutes. Honor guards moved in precision across the field, carrying folded flags and rifles, polished to a mirror shine. Buglers stood ready near the memorial canopy. It was all orchestrated perfectly, except for the man who wouldn't move. Mike had been standing there unmoved for over 15 minutes, not shouting, not pleading, just waiting. Dylan hated when things didn't go according to protocol. He'd worked too hard to earn his lieutenant bars to keep things sharp to make his father proud. He wasn't about to let some old vet with a faded jacket and a little girl throw off the dignity of a 4-star general's funeral. He strode back toward Mike, boots clapping against the pavement. "I already told you, sir," he said, voice firm. "This isn't personal. But I can't let you pass without credentials. This is a high-security ceremony." Mike met his gaze calmly. "I'm not asking for the front row, just a chance to honor a man I once knew." That man, Dylan said, motioning toward the ceremonial field, was General David Grant, and the only people allowed inside are on the list. Mike tilted his head slightly. "And who made that list command protocol?" Dylan snapped. "Approved by General Amelia Hart." At the name, Mike's jaw moved subtly, but he said nothing. Beside him, Maya held the rose tightly, her small fingers now red from the cold. Her eyes flicked from her father to the officer. Though she didn't speak, her body tensed. She was old enough to know this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Dylan glanced at her, then back at Mike. It's not safe for her to be standing here either. This area's about to be closed off. Please step back behind the main perimeter. Mike's reply was quiet. I've stood through worse. That irritated Dylan more than he expected. Sir, I'm going to ask you one last time. But just then, a low murmur passed through the small crowd gathering near the outer edge. A woman with a camera phone whispered something to her husband. Two young Marines paused mid-conversation to glance at Mike. The tension was no longer just between two men. It was beginning to ripple. Dylan felt it, and it made him uncomfortable. He'd been trained to de-escalate to maintain order. But this was different. There was something about the man's presence, like he belonged, and the gate was the one out of place. He shifted his stance. You say you knew General Grant. Fine. When Mike answered without blinking. Afghanistan, 2007, Operation Shadow Veil. Dylan's mouth opened slightly. He knew that name. Everyone in the Corps had heard it whispered. Classified mission, unconfirmed rescue. Rumors about a 4-star general being saved behind enemy lines. No names were ever released. Still, it didn't prove anything. Those records are sealed, Dylan replied. Mike gave the faintest smile. I know. Dylan stepped back, frustrated. You could be anyone. I could, Mike said quietly. But I'm not. That stopped Dylan. For a moment he saw something. Something in the man's posture, the calm behind his eyes, the steadiness in his voice. It wasn't arrogance. It was experience. The kind you can't fake. The kind you don't get unless you've watched brothers bleed out on foreign soil. Still, orders were orders. If you won't leave, Dylan said, lowering his voice, I'll have to contact my superior. Or you do what you have to do, Mike said, and turned his eyes toward the flag-draped casket, now being positioned beneath the canopy. Maya looked up at Dylan, her voice barely above a whisper. Why are you being mean to my daddy? The question landed like a punch. I'm not Dylan, started, then paused. He wasn't prepared to defend himself to a child. He glanced at the rose in her hands, red, fresh, delicate, out of place like her. He swallowed. A second lieutenant jogged over. Sir, vehicles inbound. Black SUVs. Might be General Hart arriving. Roger, Dylan replied, grateful for the distraction. Hold perimeter. He turned to give the final warning to Mike, but stopped when he saw the little girl now holding the rose out toward him. This was for General Grant, Maya said. Daddy said he was a good man. Dylan stared at her, then at the rose, and then, slowly, at Mike again. There was a pause in the wind, long enough for something to shift. Dylan exhaled. You say your name is Mike Dawson. Mike nodded. Dylan took out his phone. He didn't know why exactly. But something about this didn't feel like protocol anymore. It felt like a test. He typed a message to the captain on site, individual outside perimeter claims. Name Mike Dawson. Says he served W. General Grant in Flavin. Insists on not leaving. What do you want me to do? He hit send. There was silence again. Maya stepped closer to her dad and leaned into his side. Mike placed a hand on her back. The rose now between them caught the morning light. Its color gleamed red like courage, red like memory. Dylan stared a second longer, then turned and walked toward the command tent, something in his gut twisting. He didn't know who this man was, but he was starting to believe that gate wasn't going to stay closed much longer. The cold had settled into Mike Dawson's bones, but he didn't flinch. He had stood longer and worse. On night patrols in Kandahar, knees deep in mud, or huddled in black silence, while waiting for a signal that never came. Compared to that, this was nothing. A chill morning, a gate, a soldier too young to remember what it really meant to wait. He could do this all day, and he would. Maya leaned against him, quiet and patient. She didn't complain, not even once. At 8 years old, she had the gentleness of her mother and the resilience of her father. She knew what today meant, even if she didn't understand all the names or medals. What she knew was simple. Her daddy made a promise. And promises in their house were sacred. The other mourners began arriving in pairs and trios. Polished shoes clicked on the pavement, men in dark suits, with ribbons pinned to their chests, women in black dresses with veils fluttering in the breeze. Their eyes passed over Mike and Maya, like wind over stone, some with curiosity, some with disapproval, a few with pity. And then the whispers began. Who is that man? Why is he standing outside? Did he get turned away? Mike kept his gaze forward. He didn't react when a woman in pearls shook her head, or when a Marine in dress blues offered a sidelong glance of contempt. Dylan Myers stood 20 feet away, arms crossed, tight against his chest, jaw clenched. He kept checking his phone, waiting for a reply to the message he'd sent up the chain of command. None came. The silence unnerved him. Mike's presence unnerved him. There was no threat, no raised voice, no aggression. But the stillness in Mike Dawson was louder than protest. It was the kind of stillness that men broke themselves against when they couldn't understand it. Like the eye of a storm that didn't move. Another officer passed behind Dylan. You want me to get the MPs? No. Dylan replied too quickly. He's not doing anything. Not yet, the other man muttered. But Dylan wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe Mike was doing something, just not the kind of something you could write in a report. The girl, the rose, the silence. They were saying things the man himself never voiced. Mike's fingers tapped absently against the side seam of his trousers, where the stitching had frayed long ago. He felt Maya's hand wrap around his pinky, small and warm. She looked up at him, her voice hushed. Daddy, is this what waiting felt like in the war? He looked down, surprised. What makes you ask that? You're so still, she said, like you're listening for something. Mike smiled faintly. That's exactly what I'm doing. What are you listening for? He turned his eyes toward the field, toward the folded flag and the empty podium. His voice came soft. Permission. Before Maya could ask more, a sharp voice barked from the gate. Sir, you've been told this is a secured funeral. Step back now. Dylan had lost his patience. Mike didn't move. I don't want to escalate this, Dylan said, approaching. But if you continue obstructing, I'm not obstructing, Mike said calmly. I'm waiting. Waiting for what? Dylan snapped. Mike glanced at him. For someone who remembers. Dylan's lips parted, but no words came. Mike turned back toward the field. Tell them this Michael Dawson is present. That's all. Is that supposed to mean something? Dylan asked. Not to you, Mike replied. But it will. Dylan stared at him, unsure whether to feel challenged or chastised. He walked off again, furious at himself for letting this man get under his skin. Across the field, the first notes of soft, ceremonial music began to play. The wind carried it over the rows of headstones like a hymn to the forgotten. A Marine color guard took position near the casket. Photographers began clicking. Reporters murmured behind press lines. Inside, everything was proceeding like clockwork. Outside, time had stopped. Maya reached into her small coat pocket and pulled out a tiny notepad. She always carried one. She flipped to a blank page and began sketching. Her fingers moved carefully, thoughtfully. Mike peeked over her shoulder. She was drawing the rose. And beneath it in childlike block letters, she wrote, For the General. From us. Mike's throat tightened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the linen cloth that had wrapped the rose. With his thumb, he traced the stitching, uneven hand-sewn. His late wife had embroidered it years ago when Maya was still in diapers. It was from a time before deployments, before the shadows, before the weight of memory made silence feel safer than speech. Now here he was, standing in silence again. But this time, not to survive. This time, to be seen. just once. He had no interest in fame, no desire to relive what he'd done. He'd refused medals, declined interviews, changed phone numbers, even moved states when someone leaked his name to the press once. But David Grant had been different. Grant had been more than a general. He was a man who saw people, truly saw them, even when they tried to disappear. And before he died, he had written Mike one last letter. Mike never told anyone what it said, but the final line was carved into his soul. If I ever fall, and you're there, walk through the fire again, even if the world tells you not to. This morning, Mike had walked through the fire, and he would keep standing in it until someone remembered the man behind the uniform. Behind him, Maya looked up and whispered, "Daddy." Someone's watching us. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. He could feel it. Someone was watching. And maybe the silence was about to break. Dylan Myers hated loose ends. And this man, Michael Dawson, was quickly becoming the loosest thread in an otherwise flawlessly choreographed military ceremony. The lieutenant paced just inside the perimeter, throwing occasional glances toward the gate. Dawson hadn't moved. Not a step. Not a shift. He just stood there like the earth itself had rooted him in place. But it wasn't his posture that unsettled Dylan. It was the quiet dignity, the absence of complaint, the calm refusal to go away. As if Mike knew that time would eventually catch up with him and deliver what was due. Dylan didn't like that feeling. He pulled his cap lower against the glare of the rising sun and stepped closer once again. The little girl had finished her drawing some kind of rose with big letters underneath, and now she was sitting on the concrete ledge beside her father, legs swinging, humming quietly. Dylan cleared his throat, not entirely sure what he planned to say. Maybe to tell them again to move back. Maybe to stall until the MPs arrived. But then his eyes caught something. A pin. It had been there the whole time, tucked just beneath the lapel of Mike's old olive green coat. The kind of detail easily overlooked unless you were standing just close enough and happened to glance at just the right angle. It wasn't a regulation military medal, nor was it decorative. It looked like it had been forged from something rough, something raw. A jagged piece of metal shaped into a thin shepherd's crook, dull silver and smoothed by time. And yet, there was something hauntingly familiar about it. "What is that?" Dylan asked without thinking. Mike's eyes shifted to him, quiet, watching. Dylan pointed, suddenly needing to break the silence. "That pin. I've never seen one like it." Mike reached up with calloused fingers and brushed the edge of the pin. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, "You weren't supposed to." Dylan furrowed his brow. "Excuse me," Mike's voice remained low. "It's not official. Not in the books. Not in the museums. Then why wear it because it's real?" Dylan stared. "It looks like a piece of scrap metal." Mike gave a soft, almost imperceptible smile. "That's exactly what it is." A pause. Dylan felt the cold air still against his skin. "Where did you get it?" Mike's eyes grew distant, like they were pulling focus across years. Then quietly he began to speak. "In the jungle," he said. "Nangarhar province. It was supposed to be an intel recovery mission. Small team. In and out. No contact." He paused. "We were wrong." Dylan listened, unsure whether he was hearing a confession or a story. But something told him. It was both. There was a downed chopper. We got hit trying to extract. 2 men went down instantly. Another lost his leg. The rest of us got separated. I found the general about 3 clicks from the wreck, half buried in a trench, unconscious and bleeding out. Dylan blinked. General Grant Mike nodded. He wasn't a 4-star back then, just a commander with bad luck and a good heart. Mike touched the pin again. "I carried him on my back for 9 miles through fire and rain and enemy patrols. No air support, no rescue, Just blood, sweat, and prayers. We made it to the border extraction zone 40 hours later. Dylan's mouth was dry. But that mission, it's classified. Yes, Mike said. Still is. So how the pin Mike said is made from shrapnel they pulled out of his shoulder. He gave it to me himself. Said it wasn't a medal, but a memory. Called it the Medal of Shepherds. Said I carried him like one. He paused. His voice was steady, but something flickered in his eyes. He told me, "You saved my body, but what you saved most was my dignity." Dylan looked away. For the first time since this interaction began, he wasn't sure what to say. The silence between them stretched. A few passers-by slowed down to look. The buzz around the main ceremony continued. Honor guards positioning themselves, military brass, shaking hands, a line of black SUVs approaching in the distance. But out here at the gate, time had once again stopped. Dylan turned his eyes to the little girl. She, your daughter Mike, nodded. She know what that pin means. She knows enough, Mike said. She knows why I brought her here. To teach her about the general, Mike looked down at Maya, who was now carefully folding her drawing. No, he said. To teach her that promises matter. Dylan swallowed hard. The radio on his belt crackled. He grabbed it, grateful for the interruption. Lieutenant Myers, stand by for direct command instruction. General Hart en route to gate location. He froze. The general here. He straightened his cap, instinct taking over. Understood. Awaiting further. Mike turned back toward the field as if he already knew. Dylan stared at the man, this quiet presence, who had somehow unraveled every assumption, every rule, without ever raising his voice. He stepped back, shook his head. Why didn't you say any of this before he asked? Mike's answer was almost a whisper. Because men who've seen fire don't need to prove they were burned. At that moment, the silence wasn't cold. It was sacred. The jungle was alive with fire. Gunfire rattled in the distance, like a rolling storm, short bursts of death echoing through the tangled darkness. Helicopter blades thumped overhead, then faltered. Smoke curled skyward from the wreckage of an Osprey transport that hadn't made it out. The flames lit up the trees in flashes like angry gods, blinking through the canopy. Mike Dawson's boots sank ankle-deep into the mud as he ran. Rain mixed with sweat, and both poured down his back like punishment. The weight of his gear was crushing, but he didn't care. On his shoulders, slumped and unconscious, was Commander David Grant, the highest-ranking officer in the field, and now the most fragile body in Mike's world. One arm of the commander hung limp, blood soaked through his uniform from a jagged wound in his shoulder, where shrapnel had torn clean through. His head lolled against Mike's spine with every step. Come on, Mike muttered to himself. One more ridge. Just one more. He didn't know if he was lying. He couldn't see the ridge. He couldn't see anything but flame and fog and 1,000 reasons to stop. But he didn't. Behind him, shouts in a foreign tongue pierced the trees. Too close, too many. The enemy had caught wind of the downed chopper and were closing in like wolves who smelled blood. And the rain wasn't enough to wash the scent away. Mike reached the edge of a ravine and slid down, half-controlled, half-falling his boots, carving through mud and broken leaves. At the bottom, he collapsed to one knee, cradling Grant's head as gently as he could. The commander stirred, coughing. You still with me? Mike rasped. Grant's lips moved. No sound. Mike pulled out his canteen, pressed it to Grant's lips, and watched the water spill uselessly past them. I need you to stay alive, sir, he said, just for a few more hours. He checked his watch. 36 hours since the initial hit. They were deep into the red zone now. No comms, no backup, no flares. Just the distant promise of an extraction team that might never come. A shadow moved in the trees. Mike dropped to his belly, pulling Grant with him behind a moss-covered stump. He drew his sidearm, the only weapon he had left, and steadied his breath. 3 silhouettes crept past the tree line above rifles slung low, speaking in hushed tones. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The jungle held its breath with him. Then, like a merciful tide pulling back, the figures disappeared into the mist. Mike counted to 30 before he moved again. He checked the bandage on Grant's shoulder. It was soaked through. He tore a strip from his own undershirt and pressed it tight against the wound, tying it off with shaking hands. "Mike," the commander croaked. He froze. Grant hadn't spoken since the crash. "I'm here," Mike said. "You should have left me." "No, sir." A cough, more blood. Grant opened one eye, dazed. "You're the one from Task Force Shepherd." "Yes, sir." Grant nodded faintly. "You got a name, Dawson." "Mike Dawson." The commander smiled weakly. "Remember that one." Then his body went limp again. Mike didn't know if he was alive or unconscious. There was no time to find out. He adjusted the man's weight and stood, knees trembling. His muscles screamed, his vision blurred. But he started moving again, uphill, through vines and branches, through ash and memory, one breath at a time. Every few steps a name pulsed through his mind. Bennett shot in the neck, dead on contact. Ramirez trapped under debris. No scream, just silence. Thorne stayed behind to cover their flank. Never came back. They had been his brothers, and Mike had left them in that fire, because the man on his shoulders had ordered it. If only one of us gets out, make it him. So Mike carried the weight of all 3, literally and in spirit. He didn't remember falling, but he must have, because when the sun finally broke through the trees the next morning, he was face down, in mud fingers, still gripping the strap across Grant's chest. The sound of boots approached. American boots. "Holy, he's got him!" Medic. Now is that Commander Grant? Then hands pulled them apart. Mike fought them at first, still half in battle, but they pried him loose and carried him off just as another bird descended through the smoke. He woke up hours later inside the medical tent, tubes in his arms, dirt still under his nails. Grant was alive. Mike turned his head and saw a silver shard on the table beside his cot, twisted metal still streaked with red. A note rested underneath. "This was in my shoulder. I'm told you never stopped moving. There are medals, and then there's truth. This is the only one I've earned." DG Mike had stared at that piece of shrapnel for a long time, then pinned it inside his coat, where it would stay for the rest of his life. Back at the gate, the memory faded, like the last note of a song played only once. Mike blinked. The jungle was gone. The fire was gone. But the weight on his shoulders had never left. Maya looked up at him and asked softly, "Daddy, why are your eyes wet?" Mike wiped them gently. "Just remembering." She handed him the rose again. He held it to his chest right over the old pin of Shepherd's, and waited. The wind had picked up curling fallen leaves across the path like scattered prayers. The American flag atop the memorial pole rippled at full mast, then slowly began to descend. The ceremony was minutes from beginning, and still Michael Dawson stood at the gate. He hadn't spoken in nearly 10 minutes yet. His silence said everything. Maya stood beside him, clutching the rose tighter now, her small brows furrowed in confusion. She didn't understand military protocol. She only understood dignity and the cold sting of rejection she felt rippling through the adults around her. Dylan Myers was pacing again. The message he'd sent up the chain had yet to receive a full reply. No confirmation, no clearance. Just a single haunting phrase over the radio 5 minutes earlier. "General Hart has been informed." No follow-up. No instruction. He was left hanging between the line of command and the rising gaze of a small but growing crowd. Because now, people were watching. 3 guests in tailored coats had turned away from the procession to glance back at the commotion. A young cadet whispered something to a chaplain. 2 men in suits leaned over the chain-link boundary, squinting toward Mike and Maya, as if trying to piece together a story without subtitles. Dylan felt the pressure tightening across his chest. He had done everything by the book, checked the credentials, secured the perimeter, held the line. But the line was blurring. He stepped forward again, trying to reassert control. Mr. Dawson Dillon called more force in his voice now. "I have asked you repeatedly to step back beyond the secure perimeter. You are not cleared for this event." Mike turned to face him, expression unreadable. "I'm not moving." Dillon's jaw flexed. "You are not permitted. I am not trespassing." Mike, interrupted voice. "Even. This is federal land. I am not breaching the line. I am not armed. I am not disruptive. I'm standing with my daughter to pay respects to a man I carried through fire." Dillon took another step forward. "That doesn't change security protocol." "I'm not asking you to break it," Mike said. "I'm asking you to deliver a message." "What message?" Mike's voice dropped to a calm, grave tone that cut through the wind like a drumbeat. "Tell them this Mike Dawson is present. That's all." Dillon stared at him, chest tightening. "This isn't a game, sir." "No," Mike said. "It's a promise." That's when Maya, who had stood silent this whole time, began to cry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was the kind of cry that came from confusion wrapped in injustice. Her eyes welled up, her breath hitched in small, struggling gasps, and she clutched the rose against her chest like it was the last thing tethering her to understanding. "I don't get it," she whimpered. "Why won't they let us say goodbye?" Her voice cracked. It echoed, and the effect was immediate. All around the perimeter, the air shifted. What had once looked like a man being stubborn now resembled something else, a father and child being denied entry to grief. People began murmuring. One older man in a Korean war hat folded his arms and muttered, "This is wrong." Another woman near the edge took out her phone not to film, but to call someone. Dillon froze. This wasn't in the manual. He turned, searching for backup, anything, anyone. Then he made a mistake. He reached for the radio. Mike noticed, and so did Maya. Dillon pressed the button. "Myers to command. I need clarification on handling." But before he could finish, a voice buzzed through the line. Sharp, clear, decisive. "Lieutenant Myers, stand down. This is Colonel Adam Harper. You are to await immediate arrival at Gate 2. Dillon blinked. "Sir, repeat. Stand down. Do not engage further. General Hart is en route." The radio clicked silent. Dillon lowered his hand slowly. The wind carried a silence so thick it felt like the whole cemetery had paused to listen. And then, faint, but unmistakable, the sound of tires crunching gravel. A motorcade. Black SUVs, sleek and slow, turned onto the access road. Their tinted windows reflected the morning sun like obsidian mirrors. They moved with the precision of ceremony, but their trajectory was clear. They weren't heading toward the main stage. They were coming to the gate. Dillon stepped back involuntarily. Mike didn't move. Not a flicker. He simply turned toward the sound, gently placed a hand on Maya's shoulder, and whispered, "It's okay now." She wiped her eyes with her coat sleeve, trying to be brave. The first SUV rolled to a stop just outside the gate. Doors opened. Boots struck pavement. And then she stepped out. General Amelia Hart, decorated, respected. A leader known not for her medals, but for the weight of her word. Her 4 silver stars glinted on the shoulder of her uniform like celestial markers, guiding this moment to where it belonged. The guards at the post immediately stood at attention. Dillon stiffened, but the general's eyes weren't on them. They were on Mike, and they didn't blink. General Amelia Hart did not walk. She advanced. Each step was deliberate, precise, and filled with the kind of authority that could part oceans or silence rooms. Her dress uniform was immaculate, 4 silver stars on her shoulder gleaming with the early sun. The ribbons above her heart told stories most men didn't live long enough to tell. But this morning, her expression told another story, one the crowd had yet to read. The soldiers at the gate scrambled to straighten their posture. Dylan Myers snapped to attention, saluting crisply. "General Hart, ma'am." She returned the salute, but didn't stop walking. Her eyes never left Mike Dawson. The murmurs among the guests swelled curiosity rippling outward like a wave. From the podium across the field, several dignitaries turned to look. Photographers adjusted their lenses. The funeral's tempo slowed, as if it sensed something sacred unfolding beyond the official script. Mike didn't salute. He didn't move. He simply nodded once, and Amelia Hart nodded back. There were no words exchanged. Not yet. Behind her, Colonel Adam Harper emerged from the second SUV phone still in hand, his face tight with urgency. His boots thudded against the pavement as he made his way toward Dylan. Lieutenant Harper said under his breath, "I'm going to need a full account of what's transpired here. Now." Dylan hesitated. "Sir, he wouldn't leave the perimeter. Claimed to know General Grant personally. Said his name was Michael Dawson." Harper interrupted, already knowing. Dylan blinked. "Yes, sir." Harper's jaw flexed. He looked toward Mike, then toward Maya, who stood beside him, holding the rose like it was her only shield. "I'll take it from here," Harper said. "Yes, sir." Harper stepped forward, then stopped midway. He didn't address Mike directly. Instead, he spoke into his earpiece. "Dispatch," he said quietly. "Activate line Delta. Confirm identity Michael Dawson Task Force Shepherd. Confirm cross-reference code, phrase Medal of Shepherds." A pause. Then the voice on the other end replied slower now, as if aware that history was being rewritten in real time. "Confirmed. Clearance override engaged. Protocol 9 Alpha. Validated." Harper exhaled. He approached Mike carefully, not with caution, but with a kind of reverence. "Mr. Dawson," he said, "you were never supposed to be forgotten." Mike looked at him with tired eyes. "That's not what I came for," "I know," Harper replied. "But you came anyway." Mike nodded toward the rose in Maya's hands. "We brought that." "That's all." Harper's voice softened. "General Hart would like you to come in, as an honored guest." Maya looked up quickly, her face brightening, but she didn't say anything, not yet. Mike didn't move. "I'm not here for honor, just a promise." "That promise is why you're being honored," Harper said. Mike studied him for a beat, then glanced at Maya. She gave a tiny nod, her eyes hopeful. He turned back. "Then let's go." Harper tapped his earpiece. "Lift the gate. Escort inbound." The metal gate, which had stood like a silent wall for the past hour, rolled open with a soft, almost reverent hum. And in that moment, the air shifted. People no longer whispered. They simply watched, not in confusion, but in awe, as Mike Dawson walked through. Maya held his hand, rose still in her grasp, her small steps quick to keep pace with her father. A Marine in dress uniform tried to escort them personally, but Mike waved him off gently. "We'll walk," he said. And they did down the gravel path, lined with generations of stone, into the heart of a ceremony that had nearly shut them out. Back at the operations tent, a woman in communications turned to the master log and pulled a sealed envelope from the secure box labeled "Personal Orders." Classified. She'd never opened it before. It had only one line written across the top, to be read only if Michael Dawson ever arrives. She stared at it confused. Then slowly she broke the seal. Inside, in the elegant slanted handwriting of General David Grant, were 3 sentences. If Mike Dawson shows up at my funeral, halt everything. Welcome him as you would welcome me, and let the nation finally meet the man who saved my life." Her hands shook. She picked up the red phone. "Patch me to General Hart," she said. Across the field, Amelia Hart paused beside the casket. The eulogy had not yet begun. Her speech, carefully written, reviewed by aides and PR officers alike, waited on the podium. But something more important was unfolding. She turned to one of her aides. "I need a moment with the Dawson file." The aide nodded and handed over a small black dossier, thin sealed in protective laminate. Inside were photographs, a declassified mission summary, and a letter. A letter written by General Grant 5 years ago. A personal directive. One that had been ignored, misplaced, or perhaps intentionally buried in the shuffle of politics and pride. Amelia read the first paragraph, then closed it. Her hand rested atop the casket. "I didn't forget you, David," she murmured. "I just didn't know how to find him." She turned. Mike was now halfway up the main path, approaching the flag-draped coffin, walking like a man who never wanted this attention, but bore it like a final burden. Amelia straightened her posture. It was time. 100 chairs turned quietly. Maya Dawson didn't understand the language of medals or folded flags, but she could feel the weight in the air as her small hand curled tighter around her father's. She walked 2 steps behind him now, not because she was afraid, but because something sacred was happening, and even a child could sense when silence meant more than words. The path to the main platform seemed longer than it had looked from the gate. On both sides, guests in formal dress stood with hands folded, eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in wonder. Because they were watching a man no one had introduced. A man without ribbons, without rank. And yet he walked like he belonged. Behind them, Colonel Harper coordinated the distance with quiet precision. At the front, Amelia Hart waited at the edge of the platform. The casket rested behind her, draped in red, white, and blue, the stars catching sunlight, like whispers from the past. She lifted her hand, a single signal, a soft gesture, and everything stopped. The bugler, mid-breath, lowered his instrument. The chaplain stepped back. The camera shutters slowed. Even the birds seemed to quiet. Amelia turned toward the crowd, the wind brushing the short gray hair beneath her service cap. Her uniform was impeccable, but her voice, when it finally came, was stripped of formality. "I ask your permission," she said, "to pause this ceremony." No one moved. No one objected. Because no one dared. She stepped down from the platform and walked to meet Mike on the gravel path. They stood face to face, 2 warriors bound not by orders, but by memory. Amelia's voice softened. "Mr. Dawson, you came." Mike nodded once. "I gave my word." She swallowed her throat tight. "He said you would." Then, before anyone could comprehend what they were seeing, a 4-star general, the highest-ranking officer present, lifted her hand in salute. It was not a casual gesture. It was not tradition. It was honor. And the way she held it, crisp, proud, unwavering, turned the air electric. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "on behalf of this nation, this flag, and every life you carried on your back that day, we honor you." Mike didn't speak. He didn't return the salute. He simply bowed his head once deeply. That was enough. Behind him, Dylan Myers stood frozen near the edge of the crowd, every word he'd spoken earlier, replaying in his head like a guilt that had no place to hide. He had stood in this man's way. And yet this man had never once tried to push back. Because the ones who've truly walked through fire don't raise their voice to prove it. Maya stepped forward now, unsure whether she was allowed. But Amelia saw her and opened her hand. The little girl walked to the casket with slow, reverent steps and laid the red rose on top of the flag. It sat there, a burst of color against a canvas of honor, a whisper against a thunderstorm. Then she stepped back and took her father's hand again. Amelia turned back to the podium. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need them anymore, because the moment itself had become the message. To those who ask, she said, her voice echoing over the rows of stones, why a man with no invitation was allowed to walk through our gates. I answer this because some men earn their invitation in silence, because some debts are never written, only remembered, and because sometimes, when the record books forget, the soul of the Corps remembers. She paused. No ceremony can fully express what David Grant owed to this man. But if today is meant to honor a general, then let us also honor the one who carried him out of fire and into history. Amelia stepped aside. The honor guard adjusted formation. For the first time in military memory, a civilian, a man with no medals on his chest, stood alongside generals as taps began to play. It was a different kind of silence now. Not resistance, not protocol, but reverence. At the edge of the field, Dylan felt something break inside him. Not pride, not fear, but something older, something heavier. Humility. He walked over to Colonel Harper. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'd like to apologize. I didn't know who he was." Harper nodded. He didn't need you to. He just needed to be heard. Dylan looked back toward the casket, then at the rose. "I want to know the rest of his story." Harper said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You will." After the casket was lowered and the last salute echoed off the marble, the guests began to leave. But a few lingered, not to speak, just to watch. Because history, when it walks among you, rarely announces itself with fanfare. It walks in boots worn soft by time, beside a little girl with a quiet heart. Mike and Maya waited until the field was nearly empty before they turned to go. Amelia caught up to them one last time. "There's something you should know," she said. She held out a sealed envelope yellowed by time. "It's from David, written years ago. It was to be opened only if you ever returned." Mike took the letter with both hands. He didn't open it yet. He didn't have to. The truth had already been spoken. But still his voice broke when he said, "Thank you." Amelia shook her head. "No, Mike. We thank you." And with that, she stepped back, standing once more at full attention, as he and Maya walked away, their shadows stretching long across the stones. The ceremony was over, but something bigger had just begun. The tires whispered over gravel, like a secret the earth was reluctant to share. One by one, the black SUVs of the military motorcade rolled out of Arlington, their procession slow and somber, weaving past the endless rows of white headstones. Inside the tinted vehicles sat generals, aides, and dignitaries, all silent now. Not because of grief, but because of something deeper. Because they had just witnessed a funeral rewritten in real time. Because they had seen history flinch, pause, and adjust its own lens. At the rear of the last vehicle, General Amelia Hart sat motionless, her gloved hands folded loosely in her lap. The crisp uniform she wore had never felt heavier, not from medals, but from memory. She watched the marble stones pass outside her window and thought about the man who'd stood at the gate. The man they almost left behind again. Mike Dawson. He hadn't asked for a seat, hadn't demanded a podium, but his silence had stopped the entire machine of protocol. And now the machinery was beginning to move in a different direction. She tapped the intercom. "Colonel Harper?" His voice came through clipped and professional. "Yes, General." "We're not done," she said. "No, ma'am. I want a full review of Dawson's record. Pull everything Task Force Shepard has in classified vaults. Letters, commendations, testimonies, especially the ones that were buried." "Yes, General." "And the Walker Protocol." She paused, staring out the window. "Draft it. I want the name finalized by morning." She ended the call without waiting for acknowledgement. The silence in the SUV remained, but this time it carried resolve. Back on the hill, Mike stood still as the last of the crowd trickled away. He didn't speak. He didn't follow the others. He simply remained beside the now lowered casket Maya tucked beside him. The rose she had placed earlier rested gently atop the folded flag. Someone had left a second rose beside it. White. Anonymous. A quiet gesture from an unseen soul. Maya looked up at her father. Was he really her friend? Mike nodded slowly, in the place where it mattered most. She considered that. The battlefield. He looked down at her. No, sweetie, in the silence after. She nodded, not fully understanding, but holding the truth anyway, like she always did. A reporter approached cautiously, notepad in hand, press badge swinging from her lanyard. "Mr. Dawson," he turned. "I'm with Stars and Stripes. Would you be willing to speak on the record?" Mike's eyes were calm. "No, ma'am." Even just a few words about what happened out there in 2007. He shook his head gently. The people who needed to know. No. She hesitated. "You understand this story is going to ripple, right? You're going to be seen now." He looked out over the cemetery. "I was always seen by the ones who mattered." And with that, he turned back to Maya. "Ready to go, Peanut." She nodded. They walked down the stone path hand in hand, passing by stunned guests, saluting Marines, and folded flags, each one now carrying just a little more weight. Because today, silence had spoken, and the world had listened. At the Pentagon, a classified email thread was quietly opened under the title, Protocol Revision, Honoring the Unseen. Attached were photos. One was of a little girl's rose resting atop a coffin. Another was of a man standing beside her coat, threadbare hair touched with gray eyes, filled with things that no camera could ever truly capture. Beneath the images, a sentence appeared in bold, typed by General Hart herself. "Sometimes the most decorated man at the funeral doesn't wear a single medal." And so the wheels began turning. Not loud, not fast, but permanent. At a modest diner just outside Quantico, the doorbell jingled as Mike and Maya stepped inside later that afternoon. The smells of bacon grease and fresh coffee wrapped around them like a warm blanket. A waitress behind the counter lifted a hand in greeting, not recognizing them as anyone important, which suited Mike just fine. They slid into a booth near the window. Maya took off her coat, placed her drawing on the table like a treasured artifact, and began coloring in the rose petals with a red crayon she carried in her coat pocket. Mike watched her for a moment, then glanced out at the horizon. It was clear now the storm that had hovered over this day had passed. The bell above the diner door rang again. Mike didn't turn to look, not until he heard the voice. "Mind if I join you?" He turned. Dylan Myers stood there, not in dress blues, but a simple gray sweater and slacks. Hands-empty posture. Different. Not rigid, not defensive. Human. Mike gestured to the opposite seat. Dylan slid into the booth. "I'm not here on orders," he said. "Just wanted to say, thank you." Mike arched an eyebrow. "For what?" "For teaching me," Dylan said, without saying a word. Mike didn't reply. He didn't need to. The waitress approached and poured coffee for both of them. Dylan reached for the check and handed over a few folded bills before Mike could protest. Maya smiled. "For the rose," Dylan said, glancing at her. "It stayed with me." Mike finally spoke. "She chose it. I just carried it." Dylan nodded. Across the room, the jukebox clicked softly to life, playing a gentle country ballad that wrapped itself around the booth like memory. No more words were needed. Some conversations don't require voices, just understanding. 3 days later, the nation paused. The sun rose over Washington, D.C. with ceremonial light. A faint haze hung over the Potomac, and flags fluttered at half-mast across military bases, federal buildings, and front porches from Arlington to Anchorage. At precisely 10:01 a.m., a press conference was announced unscheduled, untelevised, unfiltered. Inside the National Memorial Amphitheater, beneath the vaulted arches that had hosted presidents, generals, and grieving families for over a century, General Amelia Hart stood before the podium. No teleprompter, no applause, only silence. And then her voice, crisp, measured but deeply human, filled the air. 3 days ago she began, we buried one of our nation's finest warriors, General David Grant, 4-star commander strategist and servant of the people. A few nods among the audience. Cameras from every major network rolled. But what most people didn't see, she continued, what wasn't written into the program, was the man who stood just outside the gate. The man who had no uniform, no rank, no invitation, but whose presence changed everything. She paused, letting the words settle. That man's name, she said, is Michael Dawson. A hush fell over the crowd. She lifted a small silver pin between 2 fingers, shaped like a shepherd's crook, worn smooth by time and touch. This, she said, is not an official medal. It's not found in the archives. It doesn't come with citations or ceremony. It was made from the shrapnel that nearly ended General Grant's life in 2007, pulled from his shoulder, carried out of enemy territory by the man who refused to leave him behind. A screen behind her lit up with a photo captured silently during the funeral. It showed Mike and Maya standing together beside the casket, the red rose cradled gently in her hands. It wasn't staged, it wasn't filtered, but it was perfect. This image, Amelia said, is what patriotism looks like. Not the medals on our chest, but the hearts we carry through fire. Not just the orders we follow, but the promises we keep long after the world forgets. In a small home in rural Virginia, Mike Dawson sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of black coffee beside him. The volume on the television was low, but Maya sat cross-legged on the rug, eyes wide, chin in hands. She wasn't blinking. When the photo of her and her father filled the screen, she gasped. "Daddy," she whispered. "That's us." Mike nodded slowly. He didn't smile, but something in his chest, something long sealed away, eased. Back at the memorial, Amelia continued. Mr. Dawson never sought recognition. He never asked for rewards. In fact, for nearly 20 years, he carried the weight of his silence like a second skin. She placed the pin gently on the podium. But a nation that forgets its silent heroes is a nation unworthy of them. Then she turned to the audience, her tone shifting, no longer just the general, but a witness. "I was there," she said, when he arrived at the funeral. "I watched him refuse to raise his voice, even as the gates remained closed. I watched his daughter cry, not from fear, but confusion, wondering why a man so steady, so kind, was left outside." She glanced down, her voice catching for just a moment. And I watched as he said 6 words that rewrote the day. The screen behind her faded to black. Words appeared in white block letters. "Tell them this Mike Dawson is present." And present he was, she said, not just in body, but in spirit, in service, and in sacrifice. She stepped away from the podium now, allowing the camera to take in the full view of the amphitheater, rows filled with servicemen, veterans, Gold Star, families, students, and civilians. This morning, she declared by order of the Department of Defense, the Medal of Shepherds is hereby recognized as an official designation awarded to any individual who, without command, risked life to preserve the life or dignity of another in combat zones under extreme threat. A second wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. And the first to receive this recognition, Amelia added, is its origin. She turned her eyes to the cameras. To Michael Dawson. In homes across the country, people stood. Veterans saluted. Mothers clutched their chests. Sons and daughters asked questions they'd never asked before. And somewhere in the heart of quiet towns and big cities alike, people saw something they hadn't seen in a long time. A story that didn't center on glory but grace. That didn't seek fame but found truth. And in it, they saw themselves. That afternoon, a courier in uniform knocked gently on Mike Dawson's door. He held no citation, no press package. Just a small wooden box. Inside the pin. Polished. Framed. And underneath it, engraved in brass, for the weight he carried and never dropped. For the fire he walked through and never spoke of. The United States of America. Mike didn't say anything. He just stood there for a long time holding the box. Maya looked up at him. "Are you proud, Daddy?" He knelt beside her. "I'm proud of you, Maya. You helped them see." She blinked. "But I didn't do anything." Mike smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You held the rose. You didn't let go. Sometimes that's how change starts." She leaned into him, wrapping her arms around his neck, and for the first time in years, Michael Dawson closed his eyes not to forget, but to finally rest. Second Lieutenant Dylan Myers sat on the edge of his bunk, hands-laced eyes locked on the television mounted high in the corner of the officer quarters. The press conference had ended over an hour ago, but they were replaying it again. And again. This was the fourth time he'd watched it in silence. He didn't move when General Hart revealed the Medal of Shepherds, didn't blink when Mike Dawson's photo appeared on screen. But when the quote came back, white letters against the black background, he exhaled like something had cracked loose inside his chest. "Tell them this Mike Dawson is present." Dylan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and covered his face with both hands. He had turned that man away, stared into the eyes of living history, and called it uncredentialed. Worse, he hadn't just enforced protocol. He had doubted, dismissed, judged. Now the entire country was learning the truth, and Dylan could hardly meet his own reflection. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," he said, clearing his throat. Captain Ellis stepped, an expression unreadable. "You good?" Dylan nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." Ellis crossed his arms. "I just got off the line with command." "You know what they said." Dylan didn't answer. "They said you held the line." "By the book. No insubordination, no disrespect. Just doing your job." "Yeah," Dylan said softly. "That's the part that bothers me." Ellis didn't smile. Instead, he walked over and handed Dylan a sealed folder. "What's this internal order?" Ellis replied. "You're being reassigned. Not a punishment, a recommendation. You've been selected for something new. Something General Hart herself signed off on." Dylan opened the folder and scanned the top line. His lips parted. Walker Protocol Cadre Assignment. Phase 1. News outlets ran specials for days. Talk shows debated the ethics of silence, the meaning of sacrifice, and how many more Mike Dawsons the nation had forgotten. But beyond the media frenzy, something more powerful was happening. Letters began arriving at the Pentagon. Not complaints, not outrage, but testimonies from medics, from former Marines, from children of veterans who had died without medals, but with stories no one ever recorded. The Department of Defense created a digital archive. Within 72 hours, it received over 40,000 submissions. A grandmother in Wisconsin sent in a faded photo of her brother holding a wounded child in Vietnam. A retired pilot in Texas wrote about an unnamed mechanic who saved 6 lives after a base bombing in Kandahar. Each story, each face, felt like a new thread in a larger tapestry. And at the center of it all, people kept returning to the same name, Mike Dawson. In a middle school classroom in Ohio, a teacher held up a printout of the rose at the funeral. "Who knows what this is?" A girl raised her hand. "That's the Medal of Shepherds." The teacher smiled. "And do you know what it means?" The girl nodded. "It means doing the right thing even when no one sees you." Back at the cemetery, 3 Marines in dress blues stood quietly before David Grant's headstone. They weren't on official duty. No orders had brought them there. They'd come to place a second rose beside the first. One of them reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sketch, drawn in crayon, a copy of Maya Dawson's rose. He tucked it beneath the bouquet. "Semper Fi," he whispered. At a veterans center in Colorado, a group of former servicemen sat in a circle. They'd been gathering for years. Some talked, some didn't. But on this particular evening, a man named Curtis, usually the quietest, stood up and cleared his throat. "I knew Mike Dawson," he said. The room went still. I didn't know him well. He wasn't loud, never told war stories. But he sat next to me at every meeting, always early, always helped stack chairs. He paused, voice shaking. I never knew he was that Mike Dawson. He looked down. I just knew he made me feel like I mattered. And for the first time in a long while, everyone clapped. Meanwhile, in their quiet cabin tucked beyond the trees, Mike Dawson was chopping wood. The rhythmic thud of axe against log filled the air. Maya sat nearby, reading aloud from a library book, pausing to sound out the bigger words. Mike didn't interrupt her, just smiled each time she pushed through a difficult one. Their lives hadn't changed much. The phone rang more often. Letters came in the mail. Some requests for interviews, some for documentaries. He said no to all of them, because the people who needed to understand already did, and the people who didn't weren't the ones he owed anything to. A week later, a knock came at the door. Dylan Myers stood on the porch, no uniform, no clipboard, just a man. Mike opened the door, eyebrows raised. Dylan didn't speak right away. Then he held out a small wooden box. "I had it made," he said. Mike took it slowly, opening the lid. Inside was a replica of the rose Maya had laid on the casket, carved in oak, hand-painted, sealed beneath glass. The plaque beneath it read, "For the quiet that changed everything." Mike looked at him, eyes softening. "Come in," he said. Dylan stepped inside. Maya looked up from her book and smiled. "You're the guy from the gate," she said. "I was," Dylan replied. "I'm hoping to be the guy who opens gates now." Mike chuckled. "Good." They sat at the kitchen table. Coffee brewed. Stories were exchanged. But most of the time they just sat. And that silence, it no longer needed to be filled, because it had already moved the nation. The conference room at the Pentagon was nothing like a battlefield. And yet, as General Amelia Hart stepped into the space, the air carried the same tension. Rows of sharply dressed officers lined the long table tablets, glowing notebooks, opened protocol binders stacked neatly, everything polished, everything official, except for the man they were here to talk about. His name sat alone on the digital screen behind Amelia, the Walker Protocol Initiative, in honor of Michael Dawson. A few officers exchanged glances, some curious, some skeptical, a few indifferent. But Amelia stood tall, the 4 stars on her shoulder, like iron forged from the past week. She cleared her throat. "I won't waste your time," she began. "Because time is what we've already wasted years of it. Decades of men and women giving more than they're asked, then being forgotten the moment their paperwork didn't match their impact." No one interrupted. She paced slowly down the line, letting her boots echo deliberately across the stone floor. Michael Dawson stood at the gates of Arlington, with a rose in his daughter's hand, and the weight of a nation on his shoulders. And none of us saw him. She turned. But the people did. And more importantly, the next generation did. A slide changed behind her. Photos of school children writing essays, veterans lighting candles, Recruits entering basic training carrying small laminated cards with Dawson's quote on them. Tell them this Mike Dawson is present. The general let that sit for a beat. Then she tapped the podium. The Walker Protocol is not a program. It's not a PR campaign. It's a re-education. She clicked a button. A new slide appeared. Walker Protocol, Phase 1. A mandatory course embedded into officer training academies covering silent service, identifying overlooked acts of valor, cultural recalibration, teaching humility and command, legacy review, opening declassified files to restore buried recognitions, human dignity, curriculum training in empathy, listening, and nonverbal recognition. One colonel near the end raised a hand. General, with respect, how do we measure something like this? You can't quantify humility. Amelia turned to him, her voice even. You don't measure it. You model it. The room fell silent again. She let the weight of that answer settle, then added, if we don't teach future officers to recognize the value of quiet sacrifice, we will raise another generation that walks past heroes and salutes empty titles instead. The colonel gave a slow, solemn nod. Meanwhile, in a sunlit gymnasium at a training base in South Carolina, a new set of recruits sat cross-legged on polished wood floors. On the wall was a banner that read, Integrity first, ego last. An instructor stood at the front holding a wooden pin in the shape of a shepherd's crook. This, she said, is not standard issue. It is not something you will ever wear on your uniform. But it is something you are expected to carry here. She tapped her chest, and here. She tapped her temple. A hand raised from the crowd. Ma'am, who was Mike Dawson. She smiled softly. A man who taught the military how to be human again. In a small recording studio in Atlanta, a country music artist picked up his guitar and strummed a simple chord. He'd been sitting with Dawson's story for days, unable to let it go. When he opened his mouth, the first verse fell out like prayer. He didn't wear the stars, but he carried their weight. At the gate, they tried to turn him away, but with a rose in her hand and a promise in his chest, he showed the world what it means to give your best. The song would go on to top the charts for 10 weeks, not because of fame, but because the country recognized the tune. It was the sound of conscience. Back in Virginia, the postman arrived again, another letter, this one with official markings and a Department of Defense seal. Maya skipped out onto the porch to greet him bare feet, slapping the wood. For Daddy, she asked, accepting the envelope. Always seems to be for him these days, the mailman smiled. Mike opened it slowly at the kitchen table. Inside was a single page. To Michael Dawson, effective, immediately, your service record has been amended. The Medal of Shepherds has been entered into National Military Archives as a recognized act of valor, with your name listed first. The new Walker Protocol will be administered under your moral philosophy, which we've summarized from your actions, not your words. He read the last line twice. No rank outranks quiet courage. Mike folded the letter and slid it into the same drawer that held his original pin, the one David Grant had made. He didn't frame it. He didn't hang it on the wall. He just nodded. That evening, Dylan Myers returned to base for his first day as junior instructor in the Walker Protocol program. He stood before 30 cadets, all younger than he'd been the day he stood at that gate. He started the session not with a speech, but with a story. The cadets listened, really listened, as he told them about the man he'd once tried to stop. And what did he do? A cadet asked. Dylan smiled. He waited. With dignity? With his daughter at his side. And he said 6 words, I will never forget. He stepped closer to the class and spoke them clearly. Tell them this Mike Dawson is present. The room was silent, but not empty. It was full of understanding, full of legacy, full of change. It was just after sunrise when Mike Dawson stepped into the old diner on the corner of Lincoln and 3rd. No one turned to look. No camera crews, no reporters, no sudden hush. It was just a diner, the way diners were meant to be, half filled with regulars, the air warm with the scent of bacon grease and fresh brewed coffee. The bell above the door gave its soft jingle as he entered. Maya trailed behind him, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, her coat too big for her shoulders, but her smile already wide. Their favorite booth 3rd from the window was empty. He let her slide in first. The same waitress as always, Nora approached with a grin that said everything and nothing. She didn't mention the headlines, didn't ask for autographs. She simply poured his coffee the way she had for years, dark, no sugar, 1 finger's width below the brim. Same for the little miss, she asked, glancing at Maya. Hot cocoa, Maya said proudly. Extra whipped cream. Nora winked. That's my girl. Mike relaxed into the leather seat. The world had shifted around him, but this hadn't. And that was a kind of peace. Outside, frost clung to the edges of the window. A man in a navy coat scraped ice from his windshield. 2 school buses rumbled past children pressing foggy faces to the glass. Mike watched it all in silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because moments like this didn't need words. They needed presence. Maya pulled out her sketch pad and began drawing a new picture this time. Not a rose, not a medal, but a scene, a little girl handing a folded note to a man in uniform at the edge of a cemetery. The man in the picture wasn't smiling, but his eyes said, "Thank you." The bell jingled again. Mike didn't look up. Not until a tray clattered slightly on the counter, and a voice, low, familiar, unsure, broke the silence. Order for table 3. On me. He looked over his shoulder. Dylan Myers stood by the kitchen window, hair slightly tousled, wearing jeans and a soft gray sweater. In his hand was a small envelope folded once down the middle. Mike raised an eyebrow. Dylan walked over, offered the envelope, and said softly, "It's not a letter, just a receipt." Mike opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. For the day you taught me to stop looking at uniforms and start seeing people. For showing me that strength doesn't shout, it waits. And for changing the way I lead forever. Dylan Mike folded it without speaking. Then slowly he reached into the inside pocket of his faded green coat and pulled out something small. It was a coin. Not military. Not currency. But something different, aged, scratched, engraved with a simple phrase. "Leave things better than you found them." He handed it to Dylan. Dylan turned it over in his palm, swallowing hard. "Was this from the war?" No Mike said with a slight smile. "That one's from my father. Gave it to me when I joined the Corps. Told me to give it to someone who'd pass it on." He paused. "I'm giving it to you." Dylan blinked. "Are you sure I am now?" The diner door opened again. This time, it was a group of young soldiers. Fresh recruits, judging by their posture, still stiff, still learning how to wear confidence like it was earned and not just assigned. They paused at the threshold, eyes scanning the booths. One of them spotted Mike. He nudged the others. Then, in unison, they nodded to him. Not dramatically, not performatively, but with the quiet respect of those who knew, who had heard, who had read the stories, seen the photo, memorized the name. Mike returned the nod. Nothing more. That was enough. Back in the booth, Maya tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy." He looked down. "I want to give my drawing to someone." He studied the picture. Who she pointed toward a table in the far corner, where an elderly man in a Vietnam veteran cap sat alone, eating slowly, the utensils in his hands, shaking just slightly. "Okay," Mike said. She got up, walked over with the drawing held flat in both hands. The man looked surprised, then smiled. Maya spoke only 4 words. "Thank you for showing up. He didn't reply. He just pressed the picture to his chest and closed his eyes. Later, when they stepped out into the crisp morning, the world looked the same. Same stoplight blinking at the corner, same flock of birds scattering from the sidewalk, same frost melting in thin lines across the glass. But Mike knew something had shifted. Not in him, around him. Because when enough people change the way they see one man, they begin to change the way they see everyone. He helped Maya into the truck. As he turned the key in the ignition, she looked over at him and asked Daddy, "Do you think the world's different now?" Mike didn't answer right away. He watched a father crossing the street holding his son's hand, watched a young Marine open a door for a stranger, watched an old man wipe his eyes over a crayon drawing. Then he smiled. "I think it's starting to be." They drove off down the quiet road, not into the spotlight, not into glory, but into presence. And that, for Mike Dawson, had always been enough. If this story moved you in any way, we'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. We read every message, and your words truly mean the world to us. If you'd like to see more heart-touching stories like this, filled with hope, love, and the quiet strength of everyday heroes, don't forget to subscribe to Soul Moment Story and gently tap the bell so you never miss a new release. Thank you for spending your time with us today. From our heart to yours, stay kind, stay present, and remember, sometimes the quietest voices echo the loudest.